Another interesting topic that we're going to explore in integrated rangeland management is multi-species grazing. It's an interesting topic because it's sort of come of vogue recently, and if you read the papers or go to seminars and workshops, you often hear about multi-species grazing. So let me tell you the background on it. Okay, just by definition, multi-species grazing is exactly what it sounds like. It is when more than one kind of livestock graze on the same unit of land. And we're going to restrict it mostly to livestock, although multi-species grazing could include mixes of domestic and wild animals. But in our discussion, we'll talk mostly about livestock grazing together. One thing that's important to think about is that grazing can occur at the same time or at different times. So the sheep and cattle can be grazing together, or, for example, the sheep could go through first and the cattle could follow. So multi-species grazing just means more than one kind of animal grazing on the unit of land. What's interesting about it is, I mentioned it is kind of a vogue these days, and I've seen a lot of interest in it in the newspapers or in the farm journals, but it's an old idea. At one time, agriculture was completely integrated with, crop agriculture was completely integrated with livestock, and then livestock agriculture was oftentimes completely integrated. On my grandfather's farm, he had cattle and sheep and donkeys and chickens, and never really thought anything about it, never thought about focusing on one, for just a number of reasons about how agriculture is, the economies of scale that are applied to agriculture, and the skill and expertise needed to manage specific species. For whatever reason, this old idea has kind of gone away and is now being rediscovered. So multi-species grazing is again, it's not new, it's ancient. Before there were domestic animals, wild animals in natural ecosystems grazed in units of multi-species. And today we see it on the plains. There's a picture here of pronghorn and buffalo or bison grazing together. And we see, the best example is in the African Serengeti, where one species of animal will come through and it will change the vegetation, and another species will come through which will change the vegetation, and another species will. So those are really good natural examples of multi-species grazing. As we try to approximate that on the land, we often find mixes of cattle and sheep, or cattle and goats. And to some degree, we can also find mixes of sheep and goats. Again, the idea of multi-species grazing goes way back to things that we just talked about in the first section of this class. The idea that animals have different digestive systems, different grazing capacities, and different grazing patterns, which allow them to explore or exploit different forages on the ground. So just that natural differences in diet selection among species gives us opportunity to graze species and make mixes of herds and flocks to meet management goals. Again, this is something we've seen time and time again, but I just want to reemphasize that goats are primarily browsers. Sheep eat, they're very Catholic in their diet selection. They'll eat just a little bit of everything, whatever is abundant. They do prefer forbs, perhaps, if they had their druthers. Cattle are largely roughage grass eaters, so depending on the plant community you have, you can pick among these species to make a unit of a flock or a herd to match your goals. Another interesting difference between species is that some plants are toxic to one and not others. Especially plants that have alkaloids in them, such as in here we have larkspur and poison hemlock. Those are more toxic to cattle than to sheep, but on the bottom there's a picture of halogeton, which is more toxic to sheep than cattle. So there's differences among species because of their digestive differences, and again, a good range manager can engage these differences between species to overcome some challenges of management. So the basics of the understanding the differences between species helps us to know where and how species graze and how they'll influence the grazing environment. I've got several graphs here that try to show you in space how differences in diet selection among domestic animals and among wild animals might show what kinds of interactions we would have between animals. So this is a three-sided graph. You often see this in soils charts. The soil triangle is a three-sided graph like this, and in this case I'm looking at the amount of grass, forbs, and browse that animals eat. And you can see that goats are very high on browse, quite low on grass, and also quite low on forbs. Sheep are in the middle, eating sort of a mix of grass, forbs, and browse. Cattle are higher on the grass diagram, or on the grass axis, and horses are the highest on the grass axis, eating the lowest amount of forbs and browse. So again, if you're trying to find two species that are complementary to each other, that would eat different diets, the two that are farthest apart on this chart would be horses and goats. That's because their diets are most different. Sheep and cattle could be quite similar, but sheep and goats or cattle and goats could be quite different. Same is true of of wild or native animals. Bison are definitely grass eaters, where moose are very high shrub and forb eaters. Deer and pronghorn are somewhere in the middle, eating some amount of browse, but also focusing on grasses and forbs. And elk and bighorn sheep eat mostly grass. So again, the value of using these kinds of charts is just so it can really express the differences between animals and their diet selection. So in this case, moose and bison have very little dietary overlap, and so they're not even eating the same resources on the landscape when they're on the landscape together. Now, to predict differences in diet selection and how that might influence interactions between wildlife and livestock, I put both of the both of the animal types, livestock and native animals, on this chart. And it is clear why we often talk about challenges and overlap between cattle and elk, for example. They are in that same area. They're eating very similar diets, or in the same area of this chart. Whereas we don't see or hear so much about challenges between, say, goats and elk. They're eating very different kinds of diets. So when animals are in the same area of this chart, it means they have a lot of dietary overlap. It means that there's the greatest opportunity for conflict and also the least opportunity to exploit differences between species. These are concepts we covered earlier in class. It's just a little different way to look at them. We mostly focus on dietary overlap, and this is a graph that was originally made by one of my colleagues, John Walker, to look if you put the diets that goats, sheep, and cattle have in terms of browse, forbs, and grass. Again, you can see there's more overlap between sheep and cattle than either of those and goats have the least dietary overlap with cattle. So depending on the landscape, you can use those differences. The idea in management would be to somehow match the livestock dietary interests and the way they use landscapes to mold the landscape, to do landscape management in a way based on diet selection. So it pays attention to match the herbivore with the landscape, or at least to match the herbivore with your landscape goals. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples just based on the foods in the pasture. So here we have an example one. It's grassy pasture. The pasture's the left three bars. 65% of the pasture is grass, and there's little forbs and little shrubs, little browse. That's pretty similar to a cow's diet. So cattle really match the amount of vegetation that's available in the pasture. Sheep eat a little bit less grass. They would put a little more pressure on the browse and the forbs. So what you might predict in this pasture is if you had cattle in this pasture, the pasture would stay roughly the same because the animals are eating the forages in roughly the same components as they are available. Of course, some plants may come and go depending on grazing, individual plants, but the actual overall composition of the pasture in terms of grass, forbs, and browse may stay quite the same. On the other hand, if you had sheep in the same pasture, you're going to see a little more pressure on the forbs and the browse and a little less pressure on the grass. So over time, the grass would have a competitive advantage, and the pasture might become more grassy if you had sheep in this pasture. Okay, take example 2. This is a pasture that has shrubs. That's mostly shrubby. The pasture on the left is about, described on the left bars, is 45% browse, and then some grass and a lesser amount of forbs. Cattle don't match this pasture very well at all. if cattle grazed this pasture, over time they would put more pressure on the grass and less pressure on the forbs and browse, so you would expect that over time the pasture is going to become more shrubby and going to have more shrubs and forbs. Goats, on the other hand, match the pasture fairly well. They still would probably prefer to eat more shrubs than are available, but given that this is the available components, I suspect that you wouldn't see much difference in this pasture with an appropriate stocking rate on goats. Again, because goats are fairly similar to the proportions of grass, forbs, and browse in the pasture. It's amazing how powerful those differences in diet selection can be. Here's a pasture in central Idaho that a friend sent me, a fence line contrast. And the only difference between the two sides of these pastures is that on the right, the pasture has been historically grazed by sheep in the spring. On the left, the pasture has been historically grazed by cattle nearly all year round. So on the left, the cattle have put pressure on the grass, and over time, the shrubs were allowed to persist and perhaps expand. On the right, the sheep would eat those shrubs in the spring, and it was a spring-fall pasture, so the sheep would also come back in the fall. And they put pressure on the shrubs, and over time the pasture is more grassy and less shrubby. So there's no doubt when you look at that fence line that there's something really different on the two sides of the pastures. In this case, the only difference is the difference in the diet selection. Now think about what would happen if this sheep man and this cattleman could get together. They take down the fence. The cattle could benefit from the increased grasses that's created by the use of shrubs by the sheep. And the sheep could probably benefit by a greater availability of shrubs. So in essence, that's the basis and the reason for thinking about multi-species grazing, is to really be able to cause changes in the pasture, but also be able to meet the needs of livestock. So the research that has been done on multi-species grazing was largely done in the 70s and 80s, and the goal of it was to try to use several species over a single species in order to increase carrying capacity of the pasture. So if there's 24%, so if you use, in the studies that were done in Colorado, if you use cattle and sheep, you got 24% greater use by cattle and sheep than cattle alone. There may even be a greater difference when goats were included in a multi-species setting, depending on the setting. And it also depends on the landscapes and the plants available. But in some of the studies that were done, a summary of them shows that generally you can think about having 24% more forage available on the ground with a mix of livestock. I've suggested one paper that you might read by John Walker, and he goes through the numbers of studies that have been done on multi-species grazing and where that number, say 24 or so % advantage to using multi-species grazing comes from. Okay, if you can get more meat out of the same amount of grass, you can also increase economic returns. So the studies that have been done, yes, largely in Colorado, show that you had 20 to 25% increased net income because you had more animals in multi-species situation. They usually were in better condition. They were often healthier for reasons that we'll talk about soon. There's some advantage to having improved cash flow when you have multi-species because you're marketing different meat products, different livestock products at different times of the year. There's also a reduced financial risk because you're increasing the enterprise diversity. So for all of those reasons, multi-species grazing can often lead to more profitable systems on the same piece of land. Other advantages of multi-species over single-species grazing is increased animal performance or animal gain. We find greater weight gain in a multi-species pasture than a single-species pasture, depending on the plant community and the landscape again, but 9 to 24% greater production in pastures with cattle plus sheep over cattle only in some of the research that has been done. Another advantage is improved animal health, and that comes primarily from two reasons. There's generally less parasite load when you have multi-species animals grazing together because there's just less transmission of parasites among animals, so we generally have a lower parasite load. That's been pretty well studied. Even adding goats and sheep together, which can have very similar diet selection attributes because they have different parasites, there can be an advantage of reduced parasite load. Disease transmission is often lower in multi-species situations. I'll give some examples later on. There are some diseases that can be transmitted between these species, but just a general principle of biology is that there's less transmission of diseases between species than within a species. And then I've hinted at least improved land condition or range condition landscape attributes to meet the perspectives and the goals of the producer. Other advantages of multi-species grazing are a little bit harder to think about, but there's a really cool study that's been done in New Mexico, and this picture here reflects that work out of Las Cruces, where they bonded sheep to cattle. So they actually looked at this principle of bonding animals when they're young, so that there's a little species interaction. They don't actually know which species they are. They feel very comfortable with the different species. So in this case, the sheep were bonded to cattle, so they grazed together. Dr. Dean Anderson, who did this work, called it a flurd, and that word flurd, flock plus herd, is kind of caught on. Some cool advantages to having a flurd is, one, reduced predation. The cows tend to defend or at least serve as barriers to predators for sheep. And another advantage is reduced fence requirements. So if your sheep were completely bonded to the cattle and didn't want to go anywhere without the cows, then you really just need a fence for the cows. You don't need it for the sheep. Sheep have higher fence requirements, closer wires, net wire. So it's an interesting project that's been done. It turns out that actually bonding animals and raising animals together when they're young can be difficult, but some producers could find ways to do this, and there could be some real advantages on the landscape if animals are grazing right together in a way that they're actually bonded together. Some major challenges. So why, if these are all great things that happen with multi-species grazing, why doesn't it occur everywhere? Well, the one is increased fencing requirements. Especially oftentimes we're thinking about cattle or horse pastures where we want to add sheep or goats. Sheep or goats have much higher fencing requirements. There's also a lack of animal husbandry. You might be an excellent cattle producer. That doesn't mean you know a great deal about goat production. Very different species, very different knowledge set and skill set. Increased complexity in the enterprise diversity. Yes, this has some economic advantages to have enterprise diversity, but it does add complexity and increased time needed to manage that complexity. Usually we think of reduced disease transmission among different species, but I just want to make sure you know there still can be disease transmission between, for example, cattle and sheep. One example I know of is malignant catarrhal fever. It is sheep can serve as a carrier and infect cattle. Of course, it can be transmitted among cattle, but sheep don't have the disease. They just are a carrier. So it's not a huge deal. It's usually you have less transmission in multi-species situations, but it still can occur. So think a little bit about why these multi-species situations don't occur everywhere on the landscape, and I think you can come up with a whole other set of challenges and opportunities. I will recommend some readings for you on the website, and as you drive across the landscape and talk with people, think about the advantages there might be, the opportunities there might be for adding species into a mix and create a multi-species grazing situation, but also think about the challenges.